You guys are on.
Yep, it's recording. We're back official on the record now.
Okay. So, I'll do the internal fire thing and then we'll move on to yours. Sound okay? Welcome back, everyone. We played a little bit fast and loose with the agenda, which was okay. Justin gave his presentation this morning, which was very much appreciated. And what we sort of decided was, because of the interest in fire and so forth, I've been giving Adam a bit of a hand in his work on specifically developing some pieces which will come into hopefully the core infrastructure of fire. But to help everyone sort of come up to grade, what Justin and I figured might be a good idea is if I gave you more of a history presentation about what is fire, where it comes from, what we're doing in fire, and everything. Thank you, Justin. We do have access to a presentation which I flipped through once, which I may revert to if I feel that I'm floundering a bit, because I'm ad-libbing up here, so go easy on me. But I will try and bring some of this stuff together. And if I think that we need to go back to something a little bit more structured, then we'll fall back on that, because it's done by one of the, shall we call them firemen, one of the three principals who have been involved in the development of fire, Ewout Kramer from the Netherlands. He put together a presentation for HL7 UK that he gave a couple of months ago, I believe. So anyways, this is the landing page for fire. It's freely open from the HL7 site. You can go here. It contains a link to the standard as it is currently existing, released. Fire is very much a draft standard at this point. It is so draft that it's not even DSTU. It is so draft that this site can change without notice, and sometimes many times a day.
Well, because the site is generated from code as people are building.
Right? Yes. They don't always post it up to the site every time that they change something and so forth, but it can change fairly frequently. If you said, "Oh, I went and looked at it yesterday," you may be out of date. Now, standards that change daily are difficult to develop against. And that's understood. The reason is because as a burgeoning pre-draft standard, they're trying to work as many kinks out in as wide open as a forum as possible. This follows many of the tenets of open source development and so forth like that. Probably the prime person behind FHIR, Graham Grieve, is a strong advocate for open source paradigms, and has contributed to many standards in many realms, including things like CORBA, HL7, ISO, OMG. So many of his core philosophies about what should occur in terms of development and standards and how they proceed is embedded in the way that fire is done. I'm going to go back into history to give you a little bit of the understanding of how it came about and so forth. And I'm speaking to a particular group that actually has some interest. Do I need the mic?
Oh, it's for camera.
Okay.
No, this is pick up what you're saying.
Okay.
I think you need to.
Yeah. Very seldom do people tell me, "Oh, you need to speak up." I was in a room twice the size of this. They kept taking the mic to other people, but whenever I spoke, nobody said, "Oh, give me the mic."
Yeah, this is for the camera.
At any rate, it started. There have been some implementations of HL7 v3. HL7 v3 has been in development and has been put forth probably for almost a decade now, from the first pieces of V3 that came forward. It has met with strong resistance in a number of areas. And HL7 as a community looked at this and wondered what was the reasons. Was it just, you know, I always use the analogy of my teenage son, right? You know, you need to clean your room. Why? Right? Well, it should be clean, right? It's too hard. It's right? He just didn't want to clean his room. Right? He was going to come up with any explanation for why it was impossible to clean his room. He just didn't want to clean his room. And in IT, you'll see that, right? People will look at something, I can't use this XML, it's too difficult, right? Developers do that all the time. I've done that, right? So was there something inherently wrong with it and so forth? And HL7 struck a group to look at HL7 V3 and what it was doing, what worked, what didn't work, and so forth like that. They came to some of us in Canada because Canada had implementations. And I've done an actual production rollout of HL7 V3. There are some difficulties in there. The XML is freakishly ugly. When you show developers, they actually say, well, that's not actually XML. And you go, yes, it is. No, you don't write XML that way. Well, yes, you can. Well, whoever did this didn't know XML. And I go, well, actually, I worked with one of the guys that helped define what this XML worked like. He also wrote the XSD data type specification. I think he knew XML. His name was Paul Byron. He worked at Kaiser at the time. He's now a photographer. But a very bright man. So, I mean, I think he knows Randall Schwartz from Perl fame. And like, he goes way back. A very bright man. It was an honor to work with him. But yeah, he knows XML, right? And he'd probably tell you, yeah, this is pretty freakishly ugly. But so the thing is well, why is it, you know, and they were looking at things like that. And so Graham stepped back from the approach. HL7 takes a very top-down architectural, HL7 V3 architectural approach. You come at it from the top. You say, what do we need to define in terms of healthcare? It's a information management, a data-driven kind of approach, you know, that kind of a thing. You say, we need these, we need this, we need this. If we define this, then we have a common definition we agree on, then things should be more interoperable. We refine those some, things should be, down and down and down. But the problem with that approach was the people that got the product at the very end, like after all this work had been done, it then got handed to a developer and said, here's the XML, could you implement this? And the developers looked at it and said, right? I ran this through my caster generator, and your 10 messages have generated 2,500 classes. You know, I have 130 classes supporting the whole back-end business, and I've got 2,500 classes to support the interface. What's going on here? So Graham said, well, what about producing something that developers would like, right? I mean, could I define what I need to exchange such that a developer could trade it? He said, so what are good examples of an API? And the one that everyone told him to go look at was HiRise, which is done by 37 Signals. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with them or not. Yeah, okay. So in case you don't know, I'll mention something I'm sure most of you have at least heard of. 37 Signals employs David Hennemeyer Hansen, who is the father of Ruby on Rails. So the Rails standard is essentially the framework that 37 Signals use to build their applications. Basecamp is one, HiRise is another, what's the third one? They got three big ones. But anyways, HiRise was cited as the one. A lot of people know Basecamp. Basecamp is a way of managing geographically distributed teams. So you set up a Basecamp project and you communicate with each other through there.
Campfire.
Campfire, okay. Thank you. So he looked at HiRise as an example of an API that worked. Now, one of the things that from the HL7 V3 community, we would say continually is, well, the difference is that healthcare generally tends to be more complex and is hard. And every time somebody says, oh, it can't be this hard, you go, well, yeah, there's a lot of things that you need to worry about. It's not quite that easy. Because we have been hearing for a long time, oh, it can't be that hard, it can't be that hard. And what often happens is you get people that come in from other industries like telecom or banking and stuff like that. And they go, I'm sure we've solved all these problems before. And they come in and you'll get the ones that'll say, it can't be that hard, it can't be that hard. And after 6 months they either drop off or they say, I like healthcare because, the problems are so complex. And I guess they drank the Kool-Aid or something at that point. So it's been going on, and Graham was looking to see, well, okay, here's what they're doing in HiRise, but is it because they're dealing with a domain that just is simpler, fewer data points and stuff like that, and so it's not as difficult to deal with? And so he started playing around with things, and he took a domain that he actually knows quite well. Graham is not by trade a programmer or an IT person. He's a lab technologist, right? He actually won an award for some lab work that he did in his university days, University of Melbourne, I believe. And he took to programming, and he's a very good programmer, by the way, too. He's one of these multidisciplinary guys. But he put together some XML for the area that he knows best, which is lab reports. And he sent it out to a few people. And I actually happened to be one of the people that he first sent it to. And he sent it out and he said, what do you think of this? And I said, is it really that simple? I mean, you know labs. I don't know labs that well. What's missing? Because if it's that simple, I think I've just been selling snake oil for the last 3 or 4 years, right?
It's close to that.
It's not that simple, right? I mean, it's devil's always in the details. And he said, yeah, I think I think that essentially, I mean, there's stuff there that, that has to be worked out, and this was sort of like this is almost 2 years ago now, where he was doing this, because he had been on this team looking at this, and they were looking at ways to go, whether to go with detailed clinical models, and there was all these other architectural approaches and so forth like this. And Graham was taking a different tack at looking at this. So what he also did was he sent the XML example to another IT person who didn't do healthcare. And he said, could you implement this? And he said, yeah, I could probably get somebody to implement this in a day. And then he sent him the same message in V3. And the guy said, this isn't XML. What are you, nuts? What are you doing here? Are you crazy? Why would you send this? and Graham thought, okay, well, maybe I'm onto something here. Right? Maybe there is problems with V3, and maybe, we could do something with FHIR. So they took a look at it, and they decided to use the concept of that we've seen so many times, to keep it simple. I'm not going to spell out the full thing or anything, But essentially, let's look at, well, what do we need to have in there? And admittedly, what we have faced, and what you often face in healthcare IT, is, and a slight sidetrack here, so forgive me. In IT, whenever I've done IT projects, when you talk to the clients, when you talk to the users, the customers, the business analysts, you go to them and you say, well, what do you need? And they always confuse need with want, and they tell you what they want. You say, no, 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 but what do you need? They say, oh, okay, so they cut out some frills. And you come back and you say, okay, what you just asked for is going to cost $4.5 million. You said you had $3 million. What do you need? And then they get, okay, in order to do my business, it must do this at a minimum. It must do this at a minimum. The problem in healthcare that I've always seen is you never even get past that first one. What do you need? Oh, it's got to do all this. Okay. What do you need? Well, I just told you. It has to do all these things. But some of those things sound like exceptions. Oh, you don't understand. The exceptions are as important as the regular stuff. And in healthcare, we never seem to trim off those pieces that we could do in phase 2 or 3 or 4. Or the nice to haves versus the, right? We seem to be often taxed with implementing complete, robust, all-encompassing solutions from the get-go. Which of course leads to bitter failure. I mean, even the systems that are trimmed down, they don't have a good chance of making it out the door, right? So we try to be agile, we try to be light, we try to move things forward, but in IT, we're not always successful, right? You know, we take on too much, there's no way we're going to be successful. You know, you throw these things out there and, you know, to do a prescribing system, you have to implement 20 or 30 odd messages. That means that any vendor coming in has to do the 20 or 30 odd messages. And if you go, well, let's take a number, 2 or 3 weeks per message to implement, you know, 60 odd weeks. I mean, they're a year spending all their time. You're talking about a 2-person shop that's going to do nothing but implement your messages for the next year. And they just go, yeah, I'm not doing that. I've got a customer, you know, to support. They've got bugs that are coming in that need to be fixed right now. I mean, your messaging system, forget it. And part of it is because, well, you can't just do these 1 message or 2 messages, right? What we need is the full 30. That's part of that, being able to trim it down. So one of the things that he looked at, I'll come back from the rabbit hole. Thank you for putting up with me. One of the things that he looked at was, do we need to put all of it in there, right? And he went back to his lab stuff. Because lab has, you know, here's the things we always report on. But we include all this other stuff because, you know, 10% of the time we have this, and 10% of the time they can't describe this, and another, and you know, and then we start mushing them back and forth, right? We have things that we can't measure, but they need to report. And Graham liked a lot of the concepts in CDA, Compound Document Architecture, and he liked some of the stuff that happened in V2. He was very familiar with V2. He's actually an expert on V2, particularly in the lab space, and how things were done. One of the true advantages of CDA, if you're not familiar with it, and I don't know how familiar you are with all the different technologies, but CDA, even when you have your most finely defined CDA document that has all the discrete data, my simplest, dumb 20 lines of JavaScript and a CSS can display it in a browser. And the doctor will catch the full meaning, right? The doctor does not need to be worried. I, as a software developer, don't need to be worried that I have not presented something to him that conveyed the full information. Because CDA has a text block, and then it has the discrete stuff, the little pieces of information that said, measured the actual blood pressure, the diastolic and the systolic. Here's the temperature, and the units were centigrade, Celsius, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it says, you know, temp, colon, 37 point whatever, which is what the doctor wants to see. And then it's got the coded information. This is one of the things that makes CDA approachable by a lot of implementers. So he said, what we need to have is we need to have text as well as the discrete information, so that there's something, it becomes easy, right? The level that I need to achieve in order to take the message and show something is very straightforward, right? I don't need to invest weeks and weeks of a developer's time just to understand where my 5 data items are in the message. And if you've looked at some messages in V3, honestly, that's where they are, right? So he also said, well, the other stuff, you know, the stuff that only happens like, say, 20% of the time, why are we always including that, right? Because what happens is we get into these long discussions about this has to be in it, it has to be defined this, and we come up with this thing where, you know, for people to describe a person, I've got a first name and a last name and maybe some other names. You know, but in the Netherlands they have voorvoegsels. We were having this discussion earlier. But North Americans really don't care about voorvoegsels. Most of you have no idea what that is. Okay, which means that you don't care. And you will build systems that don't care about voorvoegsels. And the Dutch people that live here will learn to ignore it. In the Netherlands, it's vitally... But the Netherlands, although they can be very vocal at an HL7 meeting, don't really describe what goes on in, let's pick a number and say 80% of the installations. Or they don't describe what happens in 80% of the messages. They have requirements that need to be met. Now, because Graham was familiar with V2, and the real downfall of V2 was the extension mechanism. So, pardon me, I took grade 1 in the States, so I say Z segments, Z segments, blah, blah, it'll slip out, it'll go back and forth, right? Z segments are like the wild, wild west, okay? You define them at will, and people put whatever they want in there, and sometimes they put stuff in there that shouldn't be there in the first place that actually has a spot. And the problem with V2 is Justin and I get together, we say, I say, I'm sending you this message. This goes here, this goes here. Justin goes, okay, great, wonderful, great. Lorraine then comes on and goes, oh, you're doing this message? Here's my version of it. Justin has to have the same conversation and the same development time all over again, because anything he discussed with me is irrelevant, because Lorraine will have done something probably significantly different, although somewhat similar. And all V2 implementations tend to be point to point. We tend to call that a trading agreement in HL7 terms when we're talking interoperability. Justin and I have a trading agreement. Justin and Lorraine have a trading agreement. Now, if we all get together, we can come up with a single trading agreement. My experience in Alberta with labs has, yeah, good luck.
Every source system in
Is
Alberta
it
is
because the
different.
system that starts with an M and it's 10?
No, actually.
Not even,
No.
not even those.
Labs is particularly problematic because the system vendors out there are protecting their space very, very rigorously. So they say, well, I send you everything you need right now. You know, I may send you the patient's name in the Z segment, and I may send you the doctor's name in the observation segment. But I've given you everything, so why should I change?
Well, the other thing is that lab was automated earlier than many other things, and so there's more legacy there.
Yeah, there's a lot of legacy, there's money invested,
Yeah.
and they want to charge you an arm and a leg to upgrade their system. That's coupled with the fact, of course, that they actually haven't upgraded their system, which indicates, you know, I can't clean my room because there's something on TV I had to watch. Once again. So Graham was concerned that if you cut pieces out, then you're forced with having to have an extension mechanism. But a lot of extension mechanisms became wild, open, free. So what he said is, we will bake the extensions into the methodology. In other words, we expect you to use extensions. You may even use extensions extensively. But the way and how you use extensions will be formalized. You cannot use extensions for things that exist, so I cannot put person name into an extension in the patient object because it has a person name. I may be able to define a Dutch person name which has the Voorvoegsel cut out of it, but that's an extension. I'm not sure if I've done that right. That one. You clarify me on, you're on the governance board.
No, I'm on the management board.
Aren't you looking at these things? Or is that the governance board? Okay.
I'm
Sorry.
a little confused that with
That's okay, the students will know it better if you do shrink it up.
You look at the specs sometimes, and Adam can tell you, sometimes you're making it up.
Yeah, I mean, actually, in general, because it's a new standard, we're developing it and applying new methodologies to developing the standard at the same time. We are at some points discussing among ourselves how to do things, i.e. making it up as we go.
Yes, yes. Okay.
It's completed out.
We're consensus building, that's what we're doing, yeah. Which means we have heated fire discussions on Skype. You did what? You broke all of my loads. Change that back, what were you doing? You've seen some of them. So anyways, extensions are part, at the core, of what a fire exchange thing is. Now they've settled on the phrase, and you'll forgive me a little bit about this one, because here I'm a little bit, there's probably some methodology underneath it, but the core piece of exchange is called a resource. I think some of the key people in fire have a very clear idea what that is. I'm not sure that I agree with what their clear idea is. I'm not sure that they've actually explained what their clear idea is. But they've arrived at a chunk of exchange, i.e. I can send this to you, you can send it back to me. It generally exists on its own. A resource is something that I would save, that I would have a unique key into, that I would find, these sorts of things. Something that I would never look up unless it was in the context of something else is part of a resource. It might be a chunk or something.
So I have a question. And it's always been something I've been to ask about fires. Sometimes you have a resource in healthcare, but a lot of it's event driven. Like you were discharged from. Now, how does fire handle that in a resource?
Fires are more about the information payloads than the
Rather than
workflows.
workflow? Okay.
Yeah.
Workflows left generally open to applications to innovate on, but there are some places where workflow comes in, particularly around
Merge with patient.
or order and response,
The promise.
Yeah, the promise and fulfillment cycle. But primarily, it's around these are the information payloads you're going to track, and so a resource should be something that you would assign an ID to. Right?
Okay.
Something that you're going to track.
Yeah, thing.
As an instance. Yeah.
So, and that's a fair enough explanation. There are, as you get down into details, there are always those debates about what is the piece that you would track. And part of that is, and this is something that's a little bit different in fire, and that I think that all of us are wrestling with it at some point, is the difference in aspect of approach, right? When V3 as a top-down model-driven, you would lay out a series of thou shalts, in terms of laws, and you could definitively say objectively, this met the criteria, this did not, right? I mean, we were having a discussion before, that's not HL7, right, sort of idea. Fire is a lot less. Fire is a lot more about negotiation and understanding and practicality, and whenever you throw that into the mix, which is something that we as developers always do, but it's not a hard and fast rule that you can follow. Sometimes you can't say this is a better resource than that is, right? Sometimes, I mean, the concept of 80% which is semi-formalized. I threw out there, and I actually gave you two different definitions, and none of you objected to that. That's actually been a problem for them. Because the concept, 80% has been bandied about a lot. So the rule is 80%. Now 80% of what has been bandied about, but the concept is not firm.
80% of what assessed by who?
Yes. Which is a very valid question. You know, when somebody says, in my estimation, 80% of the applications don't, now do you mean 80% of the applications or 80% of the messages? Right? I mean, if my application has this field, does that make it valid? Even though I only send it once every million messages? So there are a lot of discussions. Actually, if it's only once every billion, then it probably falls off and nobody's going to complain about it. And there are, you know, is it significant and so forth? Do we include it? And there's a lot of pushback, and people, and this is something that I want to put up front about the resources themselves. People get very touchy about putting some of their data into an extension. They feel that makes it non-standard. That they feel that that's then uncontrolled, right? And that's not it at all. As a matter of fact, in all likelihood, you may not exchange any resources in a production FHIR when that comes that does not have extensions in the resources. Every single resource that you would ever implement may have at least one or two extensions. Now, because of this, that's an important concept, right? Now, that means really extensions are baked in. Extensions need to work, extensions need to support, and extensions need to be conformant in the ways that the rest of the attributes generally are. So when I say you need to give me a person, and a person must have a name, and a person should have a birth date. I'm going to use the generic terms, please forgive me. And an ID, sorry?
A gender.
Yes, and a gender, right? And that's it. You know, the question comes up, well, what about date of death? Well, I don't think date of death actually falls in the 80%. So it's an extension. It's a very simple extension, date of death. Just send an extension with date of death whenever. Now, part of that is well, if the patient's dead, you kind of got to know. Okay. This is important. You should be paying attention to this. Okay? So, I'll set a must understand flag. Right? So I'm going to send you an extension, and you need to look at the here. If you don't process this extension, you can't deal with this resource. Okay? That's part of it, right? So it's tightly coupled. You can't have a resource almost without extensions. That date of death extension is actually registered at HL7. Okay? When the spec gets produced, you'll have a list of extensions on this object for different conformance profiles that says, you're sending a patient that is deceased, right? Information of patient resource, and the patient is deceased. You will include this extension, which has date of death. Right? And so that's the way it kind of gets baked in.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think we're still doing okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to go into how resources are defined? And then that kind of...
A little bit. I'm going to cover some of the underlying architecture as well. Now I mentioned high-rise a little while ago because, you know, some of the concepts that were carried in high-rise were about the exchange of the data. But there's also a behavioral framework there as well, and that's REST. Oh dear Lord, I've forgotten the REST. REST stands for... There we go, thank you. Sorry. I should know this. Just call it REST all the time, right? REST, now I did read the original doctoral dissertation. I have it somewhere in one of my archives somewhere. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Pirates of the Caribbean. It's more of a guideline than a rule, right? And so people have taken the fielding dissertation, and have been trying to implement it rigidly, not rigidly ever since, with varying degrees and lots of discussion about, oh, this should be done this way. Well, I think it actually should be like, and he has his own views of what actually should happen, and it goes back and forth. The Rails team has some very strong views on what should happen. Because they're one of the leading implementations that uses a lot of REST, they carry a lot of weight. That does not necessarily mean they're correct in all instances, but it's a basis to go on. Okay. Disclaimer, I drank the Ruby Kool-Aid a long time ago. Sorry, I just want you to know, right? I love it as a language. I was telling Justin, right, I had a patch that I was thinking of submitting to Active Record because I needed to monkey patch something, and I couldn't do it quite the way that I was going to submit, but I just didn't get around to. Tomorrow I'm leaving to go to Belgium for a conference on Ruby Motion, which is Ruby on iOS. So, inspect. Thatch inspect.
Sorry?
Thatch inspect.
Yeah.
You're looking it up. I saw
Yeah.
you type it. Laurent Sansonetti left Apple. He was the lead on the Mac Ruby team. He left Apple to develop this product called Ruby Motion. And his company is in Brussels, so they're doing a conference. They're actually doing training sessions right now, and Thursday, Friday is just a conference with speakers and stuff like that. So that's where I'm going to be at the end of the week. So I'm not putting forward that Rails is the REST way, right? I recognize that they have views, they've done a lot of things, and they have a lot of experience, okay? But they don't necessarily match Fielding's views in all of their implementations. From what I've seen,
does anybody match Fielding's views?
Hmm?
Does anybody actually match Fielding's views of what REST should be? I don't think anybody does.
see, that's a very good question. The answer to that is no.
I've seen that question asked, I think, yeah.
And I don't think Fielding writes code, so.
Here's the thing that you should never define what a resource looks like. It should be discoverable.
Yeah, he came out with a blog post or something like this that said, "You're all doing it wrong." He said, "What are you doing?" "Nothing." "But you're all doing it wrong." Okay, whatever. REST was seen as a mechanism for defining the exchange of the resources. And so FHIR decided to go with a resource concept. They were very careful about what they called it, and they've settled on resource. And they bandied some terms about and so forth like this. In RIMBAA, we had actually come up with a concept called a SMRF. A SMRF, yeah. Small model...
Interchange fragments.
Yeah, interchange fragment, yes. So, which were sort of rim chunks. Chunk was another term that was used, right? It was a chunk of stuff based on the rim that we would throw back and forth to each other, right? So not full RMIMs, but sort of almost like cements.
And something that covered like a logical unit of work that you could knit together.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Like a person sort of idea, right? And so when FHIR came up, a lot of the concepts wove together and worked well. Anne Wrightson at NHS Wales, which is not part of NHS UK, just a word of warning. NHS Scotland and NHS Wales are not part of NHS UK. So NHS UK doesn't cover the UK. But Anne Wrightson at NHS Wales had been working with the concept of exchanging cements, actually. So if you look at go back to the RMIM diagrams and so forth, cements are those common pieces. So whenever you have a patient I'll use the actual phrase, a patient universal, which is everything you can define about a patient. They've created a cement so that on every arm end you don't have to say, okay, now pull in all these things and all this and machines, because they were scared that they would start to look different. And actually they did in a lot of cases even then. And then people define their own patients that were slightly different because, oh, I don't need that, but I need all the rest of it. But still you have this, and so that's sort of, and they didn't want to call it a cement, they didn't want to call it chunk, they didn't want to call it a smurf, so they came up with resource, and that seemed to fit. And resource aligns with how you exchange things in REST. And another concept of is we shouldn't be reinventing standards that exist out there and work. Because that's important. If there's something out there that seems to fit our need, then we should reuse it. Okay. HL7 has strongly been accused, and somewhat unfairly, I think, in some instances, of kind of rolling their own, of reinventing the wheel. We have an ongoing discussion with OMG about XMI versus MIF. Why can't you use XMI? Doesn't XMI cover it? We've gone back and forth about this many times. So there's some sensitivity to the, well, if we can point to something that people are using that's actually out there that works, then we should go with it, right? So REST seemed to fit this bill. A lot of web applications are using REST. In a modern mobile world, REST aligned.
Although FHIR isn't limited to REST.
No.
Yeah.
So REST would be part of what we were doing. These portions of it aligned because we were moving more towards this. The mobile developers were saying very much that the V3 messages that you have do not fit the bill. A V3 message is too large, too complex, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have to put all this stuff on top of it. On top of which, you know, a number of the implementations were using SOAP and things like this. And the mobile guys find things like SOAP and that to be very complex. You know, once again, you know, I can't clean my room. That's my favorite TV show is on, so I can't do SOAP. I've used SOAP.
So what?
Yeah.
It's not that bad.
Yeah. HL7 V3 is ugly. I mean, it could be done, right? If you have to do it.
So it's easy compared to V3.
I'd much rather be hand coding WSDL than I would be a V3 instances. Okay. So, where that leads to is that there need to be support for these kinds of paradigms. You can't send resources over SOAP if you wish to, right? That's the whole thing. The other thing it's been coming and going back and forth. Why are we only doing XML? And people weren't asking for pipe and bar, which is the
ER7.
ER7, thank you. I should know that. I'm an ITS co-chair. The ER7 format, but they're saying, well, what about JSON? And I had personally an interest in. I would have worked on a JSON ITS. I was ready to donate my time to working on that, even though I didn't have an implementation. I thought it would be cool. Funny that way. But there didn't seem to be somebody that stepped forward and said, I must have a JSON implementation, right? And sometimes what drives a lot of standards is somebody saying, I need to do this. Can you provide it to me? Can you, right? I may fund some of it, but I need this. And we didn't want to do standards for the sake of doing, you know, oh, it would be cool, so let's do a JSON one. What the heck, right? So we discussed it and we said, well, if somebody comes forward, I'll work on it. But unless somebody other than, I mean, I don't have an implementation. So if we have an implementation, then we take that forward, okay? But when they were looking at this, they said, well, what about other implementations? And I said right away, if you're doing REST, if you're targeting mobile and stuff like this, you need to be looking at JSON. Because they knew I had stepped up about the JSON. I said, you need to be looking. And they said, well, do we make it mandatory? And I said, no. I said, the problem was, every time I've looked at JSON, it's very difficult to validate. I mean, you need to write a program to validate a JSON snip, object, whatever you want to call it, right? Serialization piece, anything, right? There's nothing intrinsic. There are schema thingamajiggers for Jason, and they're thingamajiggers, right? I mean, they're handcrafted by some guy at night, and
In a
yeah,
small basement.
yeah.
Because he didn't clean his room.
Yeah. So, so with that, I said, my feeling was, and my proposal to Graham was, include JSON, but include it as, here's the pure format for FHIR is XML. Okay? We define things using XML. The examples are XML. We show you how to do it. We provide schemas in XML. Then we show you what it looks like in JSON and how to convert the XML to JSON. So you have an option of exchanging in either XML or JSON. And that's tied together from the core. So you're not mandatory. I don't think it's mandatory to support either. That to be a FHIR compliant, you must send XML, which is another thing that we were careful about. What you do send, because we have an algorithm for converting the JSON to XML, must, when converted, validate under the schema. Right? That constitutes compliance. This is important, not for the general developer, because most general developers don't care, right? They say, what do I need to send you? What do I get back? But governments always usually have this thing to protect the public's money and say, well, you must follow standards. You can't just do something crazy out there, because then we won't know what we've got, we won't have support, so you follow standards. So the ability to define compliance to a standard is often important to government organizations, which often, particularly in healthcare, define what you can exchange. Right? So, so this is where JSON fits in. This is where REST fits in. There's other things as well. There's a messaging paradigm. There's a pure document paradigm. They're working on the document because they need to be able to show how CDA is done or something similar, because that will mean latching into the American marketplace with the meaningful use, which is all predicated on the CDA CCD spec.
Yeah, and XDS.
Yes. Right. And so that one of the things they recognized with V3 is they did not embrace the American market. So they went out with V3 and they said, here's this wonderful new thing, use it. And the American market said,
Parts of it is, but
yeah.
yeah.
And so most of the American market just ignored it. And so if you have a standard that isn't implemented in the US, it's sometimes, particularly for a US-based organization, no matter how international they claim to be, it's difficult to generate interest. There are those components. REST is not mandatory. REST is one of the representations that most people have latched onto because they're interested in the exchange paradigm. They use REST as a replacement for SOAP and so forth and fit in with it, and they found this useful. A lot of things, for instance, if you're driving it from JavaScript, can do REST very well, quite easily. You know, a lot of languages have REST things built in. Java has REST built in, .NET has REST built in, and so forth, with REST libraries that you can do things. Objective-C has a reasonable REST library. So what we've arrived at is sort of some of the things that you'd see in there, what you can expect to see in the general format of what FHIR is. The history behind it as it rolls forward. They're now getting into the hard kind of nuts and bolts of actually defining a standard. And this is where the difficulties will come up, quite honestly, right? Because now you're getting into that discussion where people are saying, I want this attribute in, and somebody says, no, that should be an extension. And you're really dealing with pragmatism and so forth like that, and that's going to take negotiation and people to understand what goes forward. If that's successful, they will come up with a base list of resources. They will come up with a base list of resources. The hope is that it will be through successful negotiation. Let me put it that way.
There is a base list currently available.
Yes. No, not all of those have been defined yet, though.
Not all the resources have been defined, but the list is there.
Yeah, there's a list of what those resources are. What does the base count at? Do they have how many resources?
That's something in the 20-something range, I think. Let me just look.
Okay. I have heard, and Lorraine has heard, varying numbers on how many HL7. So you could actually define a resource that was not HL7. That means you have a resource that isn't blessed by HL7. There's nothing wrong with that. You can define extensions that are not HL7. If Justin and I are going back and forth, I may say, we're using the patient resource. He goes, great. We'll use this conformance set, which has these extensions. He'll go, great. And he'll say, can you send me this? And I'll go, well, that's not in there. And he said, well, let's define an extension. Great. We'll define an extension, put it in, we can trade it. Now, I may not be able to trade with Lorraine if I say must understand, because she doesn't know what that is. She just can't get one of these things out of the blue and go, what the heck is this thing? But I do have the capability of telling HL7, hey, I defined this thing. Do you want to put it on your list of extensions that have been defined? So there's extensions that HL7 will define and may become mandatory to form part of the resource. And then there's extensions that other people have defined that they published so that people know, well, what is the idea, what is it doing, what does it need to do, that they can go to and find.
The current list is 45, by the way.
45? So the numbers I heard, in total, how many resources will there be? The ballpark numbers that Lloyd and Graham were saying. Lloyd said less than 100, 90 something. Graham said, I think about 130 or 140.
Yeah, the goal for the first DSTU, the draft standard trial use, is enough to cover the same clinical span that a CCD
Yeah.
right? So that's a subset still, but it's sort of the core pieces.
So we've cut off that. CCD covers these realms. It has this kinds of information stored, right? And they've defined the resources that are necessary to do the same thing as what CCD does. And that's for the first DSTU draft standard for trial use. What that means is when something is voted in as DSTU, you have to have people that have actually implemented the standard. But it's a trial phase. So when it's DSTU, you have the standard, people will try it out. The idea is that what you learn during the trial, you'll then apply, and you'll actually, in 2 years' time, most DSTUs only last 2 years. You can extend them and so forth like that. But when you reach the end of that 2-year phase, you will then make changes as necessary as you've determined and create a normative standard. And the normative standard, in ANSI terms, lasts for 5 years. HL7 submits all of their stuff to ANSI, which is the American Standards Body. So they follow the ANSI rules very carefully. And most of the other standards bodies are okay with what ANSI does, so that makes it okay. So they're fine with that. So this, can you scroll it up a little bit, Jason? The R at the top defines the actual resource entry point. That's defined somewhere in the overall page. All of these have links. Everything posts onto the web. So everything is done via web publishing. The standard is available via web, sort of idea. Yeah. So they've been upgrading some of it with hiding some of the things and additional JavaScript and so forth like that. You can skip back and forth. You can skip to the core definitions of each of the chunks as they go. This overall thing is a resource, right? What that means is, you can have 0 or 1 animal. What's the formal name for that?
Non-human living subject.
No. The chunk that's not a resource, it doesn't stand alone, but it forms part of it. There's a formal name. It's kind of a reusable element, or it's a separate entity. So this is a subgrouping, right? So you might not have animal at all up here, in which case so one of the things, the first thing that you always get whenever you start trading patient messages in V3 is, what the heck is a non-person living subject?
That's a human-admitted dog.
Yeah, and they go, what? why the heck do I have this on my XML? And because it's there as an option, it has to be because of the RIM, right? And I'm dealing with, you know, breast cancer system. Why is it possible for me to enter dogs?
There are people too.
I don't get into that debate.
They're non-person living subjects, actually.
Well, what I'm saying is we track those separately. In those systems, you wouldn't see the animal, right? You'd never see XML that had an animal thing. You wouldn't see a schema that. Yeah, I guess you would see the
We
schema.
just had a discussion last week about the point where a carrot turned from a non-human living subject to food.
No, the carrot's the entity, right? It depends on what role it's playing. It participates in the act.
Standards developers, we already weird bunch.
Define anything in a known physical universe. That's the definition of what RIMS do.
But you'll see that there's, you know, 0 to many. It uses standard UML, which was something else. A lot of people said, particularly when they went back to the MIF, you know, if you can't do it with UML, I can't do it with my tools. And so they do a UML diagram, which makes a lot more people happy. For a lot of us, it really doesn't provide any more or less information, but it makes people happy, and sometimes, you know, making your son happy will actually get him to clean your room, his room, right? That's all you're interested in, right? If he just picks up the dirty laundry, okay, we're all good, right? Yes, I promise to take you to the amusement park. But anyway, so you see the pieces. This doesn't show any of the extension piece in here. The extensions are identified separately, lower on down.
Separate tab, I think.
Yeah.
As a
Examples, formal definition, or profiles. Boom.
There are videos in here.
Remember when I said pre-draft? Is there no extensions for this?
Not yet, not published.
Okay. Okay. Which one would have extensions? Probably observation.
I don't think observation has either.
Oh.
You can look that up.
XCS entry would probably have extensions. Organization, you said?
No, not, yeah, probably not organization.
Or observation?
I'm not sure if we have any formally published ones yet.
Yeah, we may not. There was talk of it.
So it's sensitive.
Yeah. I mean, there's a standard format for what must be in the extension, right? So every extension looks like this. So you have a generic extension processor that processes, you know, so you don't have to go out of your way to understand things, and, you know, there's limits on what it can contain, other pieces like this.
The examples tab, I have an example actually.
Okay. So here's patient name parts for a name part qualifier area.
Yeah.
So there's an example of definition. So profile is right.
Yeah.
Definition. There.
And there's definitely pieces.
Yeah.
So it fits into the general mechanism, and it's very standard the way that it's done. You're not allowed to vary out of it. And the URL, the URL value actually tells you where it's defined. So you can go to that definition and look it up. And then that forms the key, right? So if this is registered. Right now, of course, so I could register my own with my own URL, right? And I provide an extension server for FHIR extensions. Now, maybe just for Justin and my resources that we're trading back and forth. But he knows that my definition is here, and I've made it unique in the way we go, right? I may choose simply to use the HL7 provided mechanism, which means that, you know, I send it to HL7, they say, yeah, this doesn't clash with anything else. We can put it up on our site, and here's the identifier that you can use for it. Away you go. And so So I mean, here's the basis for where it sits. Let's go back to the patient and take a look at the example. One of the things that's done in the FHIR is that everything has an example. For a very simple reason. Developers will cut and paste the examples into what they're developing and then change the contents. The first time they're testing it, they're not going to go through the stuff where I generate all of this. I'm going to send this out as a string, and I need to replace these values. And they might tag them, like template them, velocity, whatnot, right? So that I can put different values in. Or I might even throw that off to my test to see if I accept these things, right? And so rule number one is everything gets an example.
At least an example.
Other ways, right?
Other? Oh, yeah, on Windows, scroll down on Windows.
So, you can see all the parts that come as this. And you can also see, this is not my father's HL7. If you've ever seen in a V3 instance before.
We're going to V2 XML. Even a V2 XML.
Yeah. My grandfather's HL7, right?
8.3.
This is, I might even say, no, I'm not going to say it, because I'm a gearhead. Even my resume is an XML. But,
Stop kidding, actually.
no, I'm not. The HR XML, it's actually a standard, sorry. But any developer that could understand an XML configuration file could understand this, right? And as an ITS co-chair, I am sometimes challenged understanding instances. I will admit that. That's a who of a what? What the heck are you doing?
This is not obtuse enough.
Somebody said that.
It's like
And your first, when you first see one of these, and you've been dealing with V3, you're going,
Rest.
They forget. That's right. Prettier.
So this is what they look like. Do you want to switch? If you go up to the top, we can actually show it in JSON.
Oh, here.
Yeah. No, it's downloading a JSON file. For browser.
For browser. JSON for browser.
Yes. Now, because of the acronym used in this, there is a large number of sometimes painful puns on the people who work with or talk about or whatnot. However, one of the lead developers of FHIR has created a blog site where he discusses some of the design philosophies and stuff like this. I should mention Graham's site first. healthintersections.co.au or just AU. Justin will make it available. There's a link, I think, from the main FHIR site as well. But Ewald Kramer has got a blog called The Fireplace to sit around and discuss FHIR. And he speaks about things such as the value for generated, why isn't it just status generated, why we have value and so forth like that. It's a very good article. I read his first one. I'm not sure if he's made a second posting or not. But if you're interested in why some of these things, because here we go once again. The JSON seems more complex than it needs to be. Once again, we can't help ourselves. We're standards developers. A lot of JSON seems to be a little bit simpler, but when you look at the conversion from XML to JSON, there are reasons why some of these things are, and it does complicate some of the parsing somewhat, but it's not, And actually, after our break, Adam will tell you about some of those complications and so forth like that. And we're actually past 2:30, so I would suggest that we take a break. and then we'll come back, and then Adam will talk about the project that we've been working on. I'll give a little introduction. We'll go with that. Sound okay to everyone? Wonderful.
You need to stand up there the whole time.
Ali was looking for you.
No, I didn't. I said, sit down. I didn't talk.
Give me one.
I just.
That's the both of you.